I'm Jane Trigere. Some people call me Jane. Some people call me Ima. Some people call me Omi. But you can call me Jane. I came here today to tell you about one of my greatest pleasures that I've always had, even when I was a little girl, reading books. And I must be one of the luckiest little girls because I got lots of gifts of books. And if you can believe this, I actually still have them. One day, I realized I had all these books. And somebody gave me a jacket, a white jacket. And I didn't think I wanted to wear a white jacket. That's a lot of white. And so I got some color markers and I started drawing all over my jacket. And then I got bored. I was drawing pretty things, but they didn't mean anything to me. And I was thinking, what could I draw that would make me happier? And suddenly I thought, I'll draw pictures from my favorite books. So I pulled them all out, and that's what's on this jacket. One scene from each book that I'm going to read to you today. The other lucky thing for me is that I actually spoke, before I spoke English, I spoke 2 other languages. One was French and one was Spanish. So some of the books that I got from my father were in French. And I'll give you a taste of them, but luckily I also have translations of them in English. And that one, the translations is what I'll read to you. But I also have one in Spanish. One from school when I lived in Argentina, which is in South America. And the reason I know is in South America is because I have a globe. It's actually right there. So not only do I still have the globe, but here's a picture of me as a little girl pointing to the globe. And there are books in the background, do you see? And what am I pointing to? I'm pointing to Argentina, where I used to live. I think that's enough for introduction. I think it's time to read a book. So the first one today is The Blue-Eyed Pussy. And here it is on the back of my coat. And I even included the inscription that my father put in it. And here's the page I copied. See? Now, I'm not going to read you the whole book. What I'm going to do is give you a taste so as to make you think, wow, maybe I'd like to read a book like that. So it begins here on page 44. It began to grow dark, and Puss went on his way, dreaming delightful dreams of the land of many mice. Suddenly he heard the meowing of cats, many cats. In the black night he saw 10 yellow eyes shining. Joyfully he meowed, "Is this the land of many mice?" But the cats with the yellow eyes answered only, "Meow, he has blue eyes." Well, some of us have experienced what it's like to feel different. I felt it all my childhood. Sometimes I even feel it now. But I can tell you that by the end of the book, the fact that this puss has blue eyes doesn't make a difference. In fact, they all understand that it makes no difference at all, because he is the one who finds the mice. "I have blue eyes," says Puss. "That is true, but blue eyes can see also, and I have seen the land of many mice." "Let us go with you then and see," said the cats. "But if what you tell us is not true, we will scratch out your blue eyes." Ooh. And so they followed Puss up and down the hills. how they leaped and jumped when they came to the field full of mouse holes. Here was the land they too had been seeking. Well, you can imagine what happens next. Anyway, this book is important because it's about feeling different and being seen as different, and what happens and can happen. For my next book, I chose The Red Balloon. Now, often you've heard of movies being made from books. This was a book that was made from a movie. So it's a nice bright color on the outside, but on the inside, it's full of gray pictures. And why? Well, movies in those days were black and white. Can you imagine? Anyway, I'm going to read to you. Once upon a time in Paris, there lived a little boy whose name was Pascal. He had no brothers or sisters, and he was very sad and lonely at home. Once, he brought home a lost cat, and sometime later, a stray puppy, but his mother said animals brought dirt into the house, and so Pascal was soon alone again in his mother's clean, well-kept rooms. Then one day, on his way to school, he caught sight of a fine red balloon tied to a street lamp. Pascal laid his school bag on the ground. He climbed up the lamppost, untied the balloon, and ran off with it to the bus stop. See, Paris is a big city, so you use public transportation to get around. But the conductor knew the rules. No dogs, he said, no large packages, and no balloons. People with dogs walk, people with packages take taxis, and people with balloons leave them behind. Pascal did not want to leave his balloon behind, so the conductor rang the signal bell, and the bus went on without them. Now he has to hurry to get to school. Pascal's school was a long way off, and when he finally reached the school door, it was already shut. To be late for school and with a balloon, that was unheard of. Pascal was very worried. Then he had an idea. He left his balloon with the janitor, who was sweeping the yard. And since it was the first time he'd ever been late, he was not punished. When school was over, the janitor who kept the balloon in his room for Pascal gave it back to him. But it had begun to rain, and Pascal had to walk home because of those silly rules about buses and balloons. Rather, no balloons on buses. He thought his balloon shouldn't get wet. There was an old gentleman just going by, and Pascal asked him whether he and the balloon could take shelter under his umbrella. So from one umbrella to another, Pascal made his way home. What do you think happened when he got home? His mother was glad to see him finally come home, but since she'd been very worried, she was angry when she found out that it was a balloon that had made Pascal late. She took the balloon and opened the window and threw it out. Now usually, when you let a balloon out, it flies away. But Pascal's balloon stayed outside the window, and the two of them looked at each other through the glass. Pascal was surprised that his balloon hadn't flown away, but not really as surprised as all that. Friends will do all kinds of things for you. If the friend happens to be a balloon, it doesn't fly away. And this is the page I copied from my jacket. See? In the book there's a little girl, but for my jacket I just picked what I wanted. The funny thing is the next book I'm going to read. It's by Wanda Gog, and the cover is the piece that I copied from my jacket. And once you see the inside pages, you're going to see why. I'm not going to tell you. But you may know this author more as the author of this book. Lots of people know this book, and not so many people know this book. And I like this book more. So that's the why. That's why I'm going to read it to you. This one was also given to me by my father, and he says, in French, he says, Pour Janie à Buenos Aires, Papa de New York, which means for Janie in Buenos Aires, that's in Argentina. Papa, that's my father, of New York. And he gave me this in June of 1954. So, I was not quite 6. So, there is Bobo, the man of the mountain, who makes food for all the animals. And one day, this strange animal comes up to him, looks a little like a giraffe, but maybe like a dog, something strange. And, "Good morning," said Bobo, "and what kind of animal are you?" "I'm not an animal," said the funny thing. "I'm an aminal." Bobo was about to say that there was no such word as aminal, when the funny thing looked around fiercely and cried, "And what have you got for a hungry aminal to eat?" "Oh," said Bobo, "here are some lovely nut cakes. I also have some fine seed puddings. This cabbage salad is very nice. And I'm sure you'd like these little cheeses." But the funny thing turned away and said, "I never heard of such silly food. No aminal would eat those things. Haven't you any dolls today?" "Dolls?" cried Bobo in surprise. "Certainly," said the funny thing, "and very good they are, dolls." "To eat?" cried Bobo, opening his eyes very wide at such an idea. "To eat, of course," said the funny thing, smacking his lips, "and very good they are, dolls." "But it's not kind to eat up little children's dolls," said Bobo. "I should think they would make them very unhappy." "So it does," said the funny thing, smiling pleasantly, "but very good they are, dolls." "And don't the children cry when you take away their dolls?" asked Bobo. "Don't they though?" said the funny thing with a cheerful grin, "and very good they are, dolls." Well, this continues for a while, and Bobo has a great idea. He says, "I know something to make you happy." And he says, "Just wait under this tree, and I'll go make it." And then there's this most wonderful scene. My children loved looking at this scene, just as I did. I'm going to show it to you. It's this long inside tunnel scene of where Bobo lives. And you just go through the whole thing. You go through his bedroom and his office and his kitchen. And there, you know, he makes a special food for the funny thing. And it's not so special at all. He takes all his different dishes and he mixes them up into one big bowl. And he rolls them up into little balls. And he gives them a fancy name. He calls them Jumjils. And you know what the funny thing says toward the end? "And very good they are, Jumjils." Anyway, that's all I'm going to read to you on that story. I want to read to you the story of Babar. Problem is that these are my books and they're falling apart. And if you'll notice, they're in French. They've got wonderful pictures and they're wonderful books. But luckily, I found one in English. So this is where I'm going to read to you from. And this is actually the very first book of a series. And the author is Jean de Boonhoff. And interestingly enough, after he died, his son took over and kept drawing more and more of the series. So, you know, many of these books you can find in the library. It may be your school library, maybe the library down the street, a public library, and certainly in a bookstore. But the first one is called The Story of Babar, the Little Elephant. So how do you get an elephant from the jungle to start looking like a gentleman with a suit on? So this is how it happens. There's a hunting scene, and Babar's mother gets killed. And he runs away. And he runs and he runs. Babar runs away because he's afraid of the hunter. And after several days, very tired indeed, he comes to a town. He hardly knows what to make of it because this is the first time he has ever seen so many houses. So many things are new to him. The broad streets, the automobiles, and buses. However, he's especially interested in two gentlemen he notices on the street. He says to himself, really, they are very well dressed. I would like to have some fine clothes too. I wonder how I can get them. Luckily, a very rich old lady who has always been fond of little elephants understands right away that he is longing for a fine suit. And she likes to make people happy. She gives him her purse. Babar says to her politely, "Thank you, madam." Without wasting any time, Babar goes into a big store. He enters the elevator. It is such fun to ride up and down in this funny box that he rides all the way to the top 10 times and all the way down 10 times. He did not want to stop, but the elevator boy finally said to him, "This is not a toy, Mr. Elephant. You must get out and do your shopping. Look, here is the floor walker." Now, who ever heard of a floor walker? That's an old-fashioned word for a salesperson. Babar then buys himself a shirt with a collar and tie, a suit of a becoming shade of green, then a handsome derby hat, and also shoes with spats. And that's all I'm going to read to you, because on this page is the drawing that I copied from my jacket. See? Well, I added the tree. But there he is, putting on his shoes. Where did I get the tree from? Some other page. Anyway, there's a whole series on Babar and what happens in the end. And all his adventures, he goes back to the jungle and he becomes a king. And you can read it in English or in French. Oh, would you like to hear a little bit in French? Maybe that would be a good idea. Let me see if anybody understands me when I read in French. One of the funny things about the old French books, the ones that I had, is that it's not print. It's all in handwriting. Oh, look, he's playing with his children. Maintenant, les enfants commencent à jouer dans leur grande chambre claire. Souvent, Babar vient s'amuser avec eux. Aujourd'hui, il a assis Pont sur sa trompe et le fait monter et descendre. C'est le jeu de hop la trompe. Have you heard of Eloise at the plaza? How could you not have heard of Eloise at the plaza? She's the most outrageous little girl. And I grew up with her. I also grew up in New York City where the Plaza Hotel is. And in the lobby, you could go and see a portrait of Eloise at the plaza. Now, she's a made-up little girl. But still, people started really almost believing that she really lived there. And this is written by Kay Thompson, and the drawings that everybody has gotten to know are by Hilary Knight. And recently, the Eric Carle Museum had an exhibit of Hilary Knight's work, and all about Eloise too. So this one was given not to me alone, but to my whole family by the author. And so there's her name. And she writes it in English and French, which is funny. Anyway, I am Eloise. I am 6. I'm a city child. I live at the plaza. There is a lobby which is enormously large, with marble pillars and ladies in it, and a revolving door with P and then backwards P on it. I spend an awful lot of time in the lobby. For instance, every day I have to go to the desk clerk and see what's happening there. Then I stop by the mail desk to see if they have any stamps. Then I go to the house phones and make several calls to see if anybody's in. The bell captain knows who I am. If there's a lot of luggage trying to get in the elevator, and these people all in a crowd and smoking and from out of town or something, I edge into the middle of it and lose my escape key. I'm a nuisance in the lobby. Mr. Salamoni said so. He's the manager. I always say, "Good morning, Mr. Salamoni," and he always says, "Good morning, Eloise." My mother knows the owner. I live on the top floor. Of course, I'm apt to be on any floor at any time, and if I want to go anywhere, I simply take the elevator. Hey, the last book we read also had an elevator. Remember Babar going up and down the elevator? I guess elevators are fun. Back to the book. For instance, if I happen to be on the second floor, I just press that button until it comes up, and as soon as the doors open, I get in and say, "5th floor, please." And then those doors clank shut, we ride up, I get out on the 5th floor, and as soon as that elevator's out of sight, I skibble up the stairs to the 8th floor, and then I press that button, and then the same elevator comes up, and as soon as the door is open, I get in and say, "15th floor, please." And then when those doors clank shut, we ride up, and I get out on the 15th floor, and as soon as that elevator's out of sight, I skibble down to the 12th floor and press that button, and when that same elevator comes up and those doors open, I say, "Lobby, please." And then those doors clank shut, and we ride down without saying absolutely one word, and then I get into the next elevator and go all the way up. And in case you don't believe what she did, she shows it to you here in one big double page. And the drawing that I copied doesn't actually show her face, but anybody would recognize her as Eloise. going to start with a book that I didn't grow up with, but you all did, I bet. At least my kids did, because I read it a lot to my children. And this one is called Way For Ducklings. And one of the interesting things about this book is that it's all in brown. Isn't that interesting, to make a children's book all in brown, no colors? And yet it works, and lots of children know this book. And if you live near Boston, or if you ever go to Boston, then you can see a whole statue, well, lots of little statues, of the ducklings going into the Boston Common, just like it says in this story. So I'm not going to, as usual, I'm not going to read you the whole story, because you're going to have to do that for yourself. I'm just going to read you something in the middle that I like. So, Mr. and Mrs. Mallard, that's a kind of a duck. They land nearby, and they're looking for a place to hatch their ducklings, to raise them, and then they want to end up in the Boston Common, particularly in the lake in the middle of the Boston Common. And so they're on an island out in the river someplace, and now they got to get their ducklings from the island into the land and across a whole bunch of streets and into this nice protected garden in the middle of Boston. So here they are. This is Mrs. Mallard, and she is walking with her children, and she's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 ducklings. They all have a different name, like Whack, Pack, Smack, Whack, I can't remember, but you'll have to read to find out. They waded ashore and waddled along until they came to the highway. So what happens when you come to a highway? You have to stop, right? And why do you have to stop? Because there are a bunch of cars. Look at this. Honk, honk. And they go whack, whack. Mrs. Mallard stepped out to cross the road. Honk, honk went the horns on the speeding cars. Whack went Mrs. Mallard as she tumbled back again. Whack, 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 whack went, oh, here are their names. Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack. Guess what? They're in alphabetical order. That's the hint. Just as loud as their little quackers could quack. The cars kept speeding by and honking, and Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings kept right on quack, quack, quacking. And this is the picture I copied on my jacket. They made such a noise that Michael, the policeman, came running, waving his arms and blowing his whistle. I don't think I can do that. You know, blowing his whistle. And he comes, and he's going to try to help, and he does. So what do policemen do when someone wants to cross the road? They stop the traffic, and that's what he does. And he tells the Mallards, the Mallard family, to cross, and they do. He planted himself in the center of the road, raised one hand to stop the traffic, and then beckoned with the other, the way policemen do, and for Mrs. Mallard to cross over, and all the ducklings, of course. So they cross over, and then he runs to the phone to alert policemen inside, further in town, that they got to help out this Mallard family. And they do. And eventually, they come right into the public garden. And I think this scene here, I think this is where, if you go to Boston today, I think that's where all the statue of the ducks are. And eventually they get to the center of the island where they go into the lake, and then Mr. Mallard shows up. I don't know where he was, but he shows up, and they live happily ever after in the middle of the island, in the lake, in the Boston Garden, public garden. So that's the end of that story. I read that 1,000,000 times, and I liked reading it to you too. We're going to read Madeline and the Bad Hat. In fact, though, there's a whole bunch of Madeline books, and this is the only one I seem to have now. I would start with just the first one. I think that's just called Madeline. But they all begin the same way. And this book is sometimes in color and sometimes just in yellow and black. And that's kind of interesting in itself. You think about that as you listen and as you look, and you think, well, yes, what would it be like if the book had all been in color? Would it be a little too much? Or what would it have been like if it had been all just in black and yellow? After all, the one we read before, the Make Way for Ducklings, is all in brown, and that worked. So it's something to think about. And here these people decided, the artist and the writer is Ludwig Bemelmans, and he decided to do a little bit of both. So let's see what that looks like. Anyway, all the books begin the same way, and this one is from my childhood, and it has an inscription from my father to Janie, love, Papa, and he writes, New York, March 20th, 1954. I was about 6 then. And one of the things that's kind of interesting here, let me show you this page. And you see that I've stamped my name here. Have any of you ever gotten a stamp of your name? Somebody just gives it to you? Maybe an aunt or a cousin, or maybe your mom or dad. Suddenly, when you're 6 years old, you stamp your name everywhere. So I see this stamp in all sorts of places, not always in books, I'm afraid to say. But then sometimes all over the book. Anyway, like right here. Here we go. They all start the same. And I know this by heart. In fact, my kids knew it by heart too. And grandparents were so impressed that my oldest daughter could read when she was so young. Well, she didn't read. She just knew it by heart. And it starts like this. They all start that way, all the Madelines. In an old house in Paris that was covered with vines lived 12 little girls in 2 straight lines. In 2 straight lines, in rain or shine. The smallest one was Madeline. See, it rhymes, shine and Madeline. She was not afraid of mice, and to the tiger in the zoo, she just said, hoo hoo. Anyway, now we get into this particular story. And nobody knew so well how to frighten Miss Clavel. Miss Clavel is the lady who takes care of these 12 little girls. And why they're living in this one house with Miss Clavel, they never explained. I'm going to repeat that. And nobody knew so well how to frighten Miss Clavel until the day she slipped and fell. That is, Madeline. She slipped and fell into the River Seine in the center of Paris. Poor Madeline would now be dead. But for a dog who kept its head. He jumped in and got her and dragged her safe from a watery grave. She's been carried home. From now on, I hope you will listen to me. That's Miss Clavel speaking. And here's a cup of chamomile tea. But look, they've got the dog. They kept the dog. Good night, little girls. I hope you sleep well. Good night, dear Miss Clavel. Miss Clavel turned out the light. After she left, there was a fight about where the dog should sleep that night. So that's the beginning of the story of the dog. And I'm going to let you finish the story. I'm sure it's someplace here in your library. Just ask for it. This is the picture I copied, see? The Duchess Bakes a Cake by Virginia Call is not something I grew up with, but this is another one of the books that I read a lot to my children. And one of the charming things about this book that works when you're listening to it, it also works when you're reading it, is that it's all in rhyme, or a sort of a rhyme, you'll see. There's a sort of a musical quality, like you're galloping through the words. Anyway, it's about a duchess, of course, and she bakes a cake, of course. And she lives in a castle, and she's bored. And she's looking for what to do. She's got 13 children, and I think they're all girls, which is kind of interesting. And she's got a duke, a husband, and there's the king of the country. There's a cast of characters and the people who work in the castle. So she decides she's going to bake a cake. So I'm starting not at the beginning, but a few pages in. One day, the Duchess sat up in the tower. She had listened to minstrels for many an hour, minstrels and musicians. She was bored with embroidery, tired of talking, and hoped no one would suggest that she venture out walking. So she sat in the tower and thought what she'd do, while the girls were at school and the Duke busy too. Then quickly she sat up, a light in her eyes. "Well, I'll bake them a cake. What a lovely surprise." So she raced down the turret, 3 steps at one leap, cleared the help from the kitchen, and said, "Don't you peep. You'll all be delighted, for I'm going to bake a lovely, light, luscious, delectable cake." The cook said, "Now, Duchess, I've advice you could take." But the Duchess said, "No, I am baking this cake. So take the day off and be sure to have fun. By the time you get back, the cake will be done." Here's a long page. The Duchess sang happily, "I'm going to make a lovely, light, luscious, delectable cake." She stirred in the ingredients all in a flutter. In went the sugar and flour and butter. In went the almonds, the raisins, the suet. She added some vinegar and dropped in the cruet. You know what a cruet is? The cruet is the jar you put something in, so the glass thing went into the cake. She added the yeast 6 times for good measure. Uh-oh. A light, fluffy cake is really pleasure. She added some eggs, several dozen, well beaten, and some leftover pudding that they hadn't eaten. Bilberries, gooseberries, cranberries, bogberries, blackberries, mulberries, burberries, dogberries, peppermint, cinnamon, laurel, and squill. I don't know what squill is. Wintergreen, nutmeg, angelica, dill. Whatever she found, she put in the batter. And what she left out didn't really much matter. Then she added more yeast. It seemed like a ton. She stirred it together, and the mixture was done. And here's the picture I copied. Now, the writer has hinted heavily at what is going to go wrong with this cake. I bet you can all guess. How much yeast did she put in? Ooh. So I'm just going to give you a little hint, and then you can go find the book and read it yourself. Because what happened was the cake kept getting fluffier and higher and higher. And eventually, way out of reach. But that's all I'm going to show you. This book is called The Quiet, Noisy Book by Margaret Wise Brown. Lots of people know this book. And the drawings, the pictures are by Leonard Weisgard. I copied the cover on my jacket, right on the middle of my back. When you're drawing on a white background, you don't actually draw the white mouse. You have to draw everything except the white mouse. This book was from my childhood, and it was so early on that it wasn't sent to me, but it was sent to my brother. And it says for Andy to read to Lainey and Janie, March 1951. So here we go. I think I'm going to read the whole thing to you. Muffin, the little dog who heard everything, had been asleep all night. Quietly, something woke him up, a very quiet noise. What could it be? Was it an ant crawling? Was it a bee wandering? Was it an elephant tiptoeing down the stairs? I wonder how quiet that would be. Oh, was it butter melting? No. Oh, I forgot to read you. It says no at the bottom of each page. I'll make sure I don't forget that. No, it wasn't buttermilk. Was it a little blue flower growing? No. Was it a skyscraper scraping the sky? No. Was it a cow putting on her petticoat? No. Was it a grasshopper sneezing? No. Was it a mouse sighing? No. Was it a fish breathing? No. It was a very quiet noise. Such a quiet noise, as quiet as quietness. It was a very quiet noise. As quiet as someone eating currant jelly. As quiet as a little kitten lapping milk. Quiet as a bird's wing cutting the air. Quiet as snow falling. Quiet as a chair. Quiet as air. Quiet as someone whispering a secret to a baby. What do you think it was? It's very tiny here. Muffin knew what it was. It was the sun coming up. It was the morning breeze. It was the birds turning over in their nests. It was the rooster opening its mouth to crow. It was the day. It was a wheel turning halfway around. It was an alarm clock springing to ring. It was a butterfly unfolding its wings. It was the milkman whispering to his horse. It was a new leaf unfurling. It was the flies opening their million-cornered eyes. It was all the flowers blooming on that day. It was the sound of an early bird catching a worm. It was the sound of the dew rising up to the sun. It was a balloon about to pop. It was a man about to think. It was a slow fig ripening. It was the new day. I think it's quite wonderful. I almost feel like reading it all over again, but I'll leave that to you. And I copied the cover, but I'm going to read you this particular story too. This book is called The Enchanted Garden with 6 Fairy Tales, and it's by Countess Serge Tolstoy. Tolstoy is a famous name. My guess this is the wife of the son of the famous author. And the illustrator is Odette de Brunière Benjamin. Now, in truth, I didn't remember any story from this book. All I remembered was the cover. The image was so strong, so stark, and it just stayed with me very strongly, even in some dreams of mine, without remembering what the story was at all. Sometimes there are books like that. The pictures are stronger than the story, and that's important too. Images is how we remember stuff. We don't remember words really. We remember whole stories as an image. And it has an inscription by the author. 1950. New York, 1950. So it wasn't really to me since I was 2 years old. It was to my family, right? And I also have to say that perhaps one of the reasons I don't remember the story is that perhaps nobody read me the story. I was just a little girl who was looking at the pictures. And also one of the things that's really interesting about the design of this book is that it's a whole story with one picture for each story. And they are stark in colors like this, or like this. So we have black and red, and then black and yellow. And the one I'm reading to you is black and turquoise. Or just a tremendously strong blue that goes in the turquoise family. Years ago, the sun and the moon had a terrible quarrel. No one ever really knew what it was all about, but they were very angry at each other and exchanged bitter words. It seems that the moon, feeling deeply hurt, made it a point to retire to the other side of the earth whenever the sun appeared on the horizon. Well, that explains it. A long time after this dispute, a powerful king governed a great country. He was very haughty, and his pride became legendary. In fact, there were no limits to it, and when a daughter was born unto him, he boldly invited the sun to be her godfather, and the sun granted his wish. That should make the moon angry. On the morning of the christening, the sun, in all his glory, descended upon the king's castle. He bent over the cradle, kissed the little princess, and said, "Sunbeam shall be thy name, and thou shalt be beautiful and happy, provided the rays of the moon, my opponent, my enemy, never touch thee before thou art married." We're in the world of fairy tales here and magic, right? Should such a thing happen, thou wouldst experience some dreadful misfortune. The king, hearing these last words, was deeply concerned, and he gave orders to build at once a tower without any windows, so as to keep the rays of the moon out. The rooms in this tower were padded with pink satin, and crystal lamps cast a soft light all over the place. Every evening before sunset, Sunbeam would be carried into this tower and confined there until broad daylight. As long as she was a baby, everything went smoothly. Her nurse used to put her gently to sleep humming old lullabies, but as she grew older, Sunbeam became very restless. The king then had a large playroom set up in the tower with all sorts of new and fascinating games, and Sunbeam laughed and was happy again. She particularly enjoyed the magic wall on which pictures of the outside world appeared whenever one pressed a certain button on a panel. Inside the tower, there was also a delightful garden where strange flowers grew and dwarf trees, some of them over 1,000 years old. Clear fountains played in the marble basins where glittering gold fish swam to and fro, whispering tales of glamorous mermaids into each other's ears. Tiny bright-colored birds fluttered around, singing so sweetly that they made people forget all their sorrows. Thus Sunbeam grew up. She became very beautiful, and because she was the sun's godchild, she had magnificent golden hair. On her 18th birthday, the king decided it was time for her to get married. So he asked the Blue Prince to visit them. He was a very nice young man, and heir to a large kingdom, which rather appealed to Sunbeam's father, who picked him out as a most acceptable son-in-law. The Blue Prince, he was so called on account of the 4 huge sapphires which gleamed on his helmet, fell in love with fair Sunbeam as soon as he saw her. And after a few days he asked her to marry him. Sunbeam was very fond of the Blue Prince, but she did not find him particularly entertaining, and she often felt bored in his company. On the other hand, she was most anxious to escape the eternal menace of the moon, so she said she would marry him. Thereupon the king gave a big party to celebrate his daughter's engagement to the Blue Prince. All knights of the neighborhood were invited, and they arrived in full attire with their chatelaines festively arrayed, and their pages and their falcons. For days the castle rang from laughter and music, and they all had a wonderful time, hunting and banqueting and dancing, shows at night. It was great fun. One morning a handsome knight joined the huntsmen. He rode a fiery black steed. And his saddle was shining with silver. Nobody knew the stranger, and no one dared inquire about him, so proudly he stood. They hunted all day long, and the Blue Prince kept close to Sunbeam, did not leave her for a minute. Late in the afternoon, as they were on their way home, a gray wolf crossed the road right in front of them. The princess urged her horse forward and went after the wolf through the woods. The Blue Prince followed, imploring her to return to the castle. "It is getting late," he warned. But Sunbeam paid no heed to his pleas, dashing madly through the brushes. She did not notice the distance between her and the Blue Prince grew greater and greater. Her only idea was to catch up with the gray wolf. Finally, it ran under cover, and she lost its track. Only then did Sunbeam become aware that she was alone, all alone in the dark forest. She no longer heard the huntsmen's horns, neither the sound of their horses' hooves, nor the barking of the hounds. The Blue Prince was nowhere about, and everything seemed strangely still. She was terrified. She did not know which direction to turn. She had lost her way. Suddenly, the unknown knight pulled up in front of her. "Have no fear," he said firmly. "I am familiar with the road, and shall guide you where you are expected. Come with me." They spurred their horses. It was getting late, thought the princess wretchedly. The moon soon will be out. And she shivered. Stars already were twinkling in the sky when they reached the brink of the woods. They followed a narrow path on the ridge of steep rocks, winding along the border of a lake. And the horses moved on cautiously. At that very moment, the moon broke through the clouds, and her rays fell straight upon Sunbeam. A dreadful thing then happened. Trembling with fright, her horse reared, and falling backward, it rolled into the abyss and disappeared in the lake with the princess. The mysterious knight stood motionless, Then he raised his gauntlet. A ray of light streamed down to his feet, and on his black steed he rode to the silver moon. For hours and hours the king and his men searched the surroundings for the missing princess, and the guests, deeply alarmed, joined them. The blue prince, desolate, roamed alone through the woods, hoping to find his beloved sunbeam. Finally he reached the winding path above the lake, and looking down, he saw a wonderful flower floating on the water. Alas, he could not know that this was Sunbeam, turned into a lotus flower by the moon, and he slowly rode by. The marvelous flower is gently rocked by the rippling waves. During the day she is asleep, but in the moonlight her petals unfold on the green water, and her captivating perfume hovers in the air, subtle and haunting like an unachieved dream. The charm binding Sunbeam lasts for centuries, and it can only be broken by a night of the sun coming down into the darkness to free the enchanted princess. Well, that's a sad story, and I think maybe that's why nobody read it to me. But I was left with this beautiful picture to make up my own stories all around it. But now you can see how the story fits the picture, right? I think the picture stays for me with all the associations I gave it. And now a little bit with the story that I just read to you. Le Petit Prince, or The Little Prince, was written and illustrated by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who was a pilot, and that features in the story. Now, it was written in French, and that's how I first heard it, but I've read it many times in English. And it is a kid's story, but it's also a grown-up story. So if you read it when you're 10, I really advise you to read it again when you're 30, and then once again, or many times again, when you're 50 or 80, because it's a wonderful story that increases in meaning over the decades. And one of the sweet things that the author, Saint-Exupéry, which in English you might say Saint-Exupéry, is he dedicates it to somebody. And he writes, well, I'll read it in English because it works better in English for my audience here. I ask indulgence, that's sort of like forgiveness, or I ask indulgence of the children who may read this book for dedicating it to a grown-up. I have a serious reason. He's my best friend. And I have another reason. This grown-up understands everything, even books about children. I have a third reason. He lives in France, where he is hungry and cold. He needs cheering up. If all these reasons are not enough, I will dedicate the book to the child from whom this grown-up grew. All grown-ups were once children, although few of them remember it. So I correct my dedication to my friend Leon when he was a little boy. So I'm holding here 2 copies of the book, one in French and one in English. Which one would you like me to read? Maybe sometimes I'll start in the French and see what you think. And I'll switch back to the English. So it begins, the author is talking about his first drawings when he was a kid. And he was reading about boa constrictors eating their prey whole. And so he decided, and now I'm reading, alors j'ai réfléchi, no, I should do this in English. I pondered deeply then over the adventures of the jungle. And after some work with a colored pencil, I decided in making my first drawing. My drawing number 1 looked like this. I showed my masterpiece to the grown-ups and asked them whether the drawing frightened them. And they answered, "Frightened? Why should anyone be frightened by a hat?" My drawing was not a picture of a hat. It was a picture of a boa constrictor digesting an elephant. But since the grown-ups were not able to understand it, I made another drawing. I drew the inside of the boa constrictor so that the grown-ups could see it clearly. They always need to have things explained to them. My drawing number 2 looked like this. So I'll stop that section because I want to move on to what happened to him in the Sahara Desert. So I lived my life alone without anyone that could really talk to until I had an accident with my plane in the desert of Sahara 6 years ago. Something was broken in my engine, and as I had with me neither a mechanic nor any passengers, I set myself to attempt the difficult repairs all alone. It was a question of life or death for me. I had scarcely enough drinking water to last a week. The first night then, I went to sleep on the sand, 1,000 miles from any human habitation. I was more isolated than a shipwrecked sailor on a raft in the middle of the ocean. Thus, you can imagine my amazement at sunrise when I was awakened by an odd little voice. It said, "S'il vous plaît, dessine-moi un mouton." Hein? Dessine-moi un mouton. If you please, draw me a sheep. What? Draw me a sheep. I jumped to my feet, completely thunderstruck. I blinked my eyes hard. I looked carefully all around me, and I saw a most extraordinary small person who stood there examining me with great seriousness. Here you may see the best portrait that later I was able to make of him. But my drawing is certainly very much less charming than its model. That, however, is not my fault. The grown-ups discouraged me in my painter's career when I was 6 years old, and I never learned to draw anything except boas from the outside and boas from the inside. Now I stared at this sudden apparition with my eyes fairly starting out of my head in astonishment. Remember, I'd crashed in the desert 1,000 miles from any inhabited region. And yet my little man seemed neither to be straying uncertainly among the sands, nor to be fainting from fatigue, or hunger, or thirst, or fear. Nothing about gave him any suggestion of a child lost in the middle of the desert, 1,000 miles from any human habitation. When at last I was able to speak, I said to him, "But what are you doing here?" In answer, he repeated very slowly, as if he were speaking of a matter of great consequence, "If you please, draw me a sheep." When a mystery is too overpowering, one dare not disobey. Absurd as it might seem to me, 1,000 miles from any human habitation, and in danger of death, I took out of my pocket a sheet of paper and my fountain pen. And then I remembered how my studies had been concentrated on geography, history, arithmetic, and grammar, and I told the little chap, a little crossly too, that I didn't know how to draw. He answered me, "That doesn't matter. Draw me a sheep." But I had never drawn a sheep. So I drew for him one of the 2 pictures I had drawn so often. It was that of the boa constrictor from the outside. And I was astounded to hear the little fellow greet me with, "No, no, no, I do not want an elephant inside a boa constrictor. A boa constrictor is a very dangerous creature, and an elephant is very cumbersome. Where I live, everything is very small. What I need is a sheep draw me a sheep. So then I made a drawing. He looked at it carefully and he said, "No, this sheep is already very sickly. Make me another." So I made another drawing. "You see yourself," he said, "this is not a sheep, this is a ram. It has horns." So then I did my drawing over once more, but it was rejected too, just like the others. "This one is too old. I want a sheep that will live a long time." By this time, my patience was exhausted because I was in a hurry to start taking my engine apart. So I tossed off this drawing and I threw out an explanation with it. "This is only his box. The sheep you asked for is inside." I was very surprised to see a light break over the face of my young judge. That is exactly the way I wanted it. Do you think that this sheep will have to have a great deal of grass? Why? Because where I live is very small. "There will be surely enough grass for him," I said. "This is a very small sheep that I have given you." He bent his head over the drawing. "Not so small that, look, he's gone to sleep." And that is how I made the acquaintance of the little prince. I'm going to leave the rest for you to read. Maybe with a friendly grown-up. And here's the picture I copied. Okay. In my introduction, which was a while ago, I mentioned that I would be reading something in Spanish. This is a book I have in Spanish from my childhood. It's not really a book of stories in the traditional sense. It's not one story like all the other books that I'm reading. It's a primer. It's the book that you have in school to teach you how to read. So you will have pages like this that show you how to use a verb for a girl, a man, many people, and it'll show you how to use the verb, and it'll help you to read by starting very slowly and then getting harder and harder as you go along. And this book has my teacher's comment in red pencils right in here. It says excelente, meaning I must have read it well. But what it doesn't have, or rather it had, but it doesn't have anymore, is a couple of pages that one day we were told to cut out. Now imagine going to school and your teachers have you take scissors and tell you to take your textbook and tell you to go to page 4 and cut out the picture of somebody or the words. Can you imagine? You'd be shocked, I think. I mean, we don't do that. Well, I was living in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, which is the capital of Argentina, at the time when there was a revolution against a dictator. And the dictator's name was Perón, and his wife, Evita, was featured in my book. And I remember the page as clearly as if I could see it right now. There was a page with Evita, and there's a water fountain behind her, and a bunch of children playing, and it said, in Spanish of course, "Evita loves me." That was the page we were told to cut out. She was going to get cut out of history. And I was a little girl. What do I know about politics? I went home crying. Why did they make me cut out the picture of Evita who loves me? I mean, I don't even know Evita, but you tell a kid that Evita loves her, and it's a nice thing to feel. So that's what this book reminds me of. Now I have to admit that afterwards I cut out other things because, hey, it was my book and it was already cut up. But so the truth is I can't quite remember where that page was, but you can see every one of the cutout pages. So I'll read you a little bit because I said I would. And when I read in French, I don't have an accent, but in Spanish I have a little accent. And so I'm going to read from this page. And it says here, excelente, and excelente. So let's see if I can do an excelente today. Excellent. Emma le a papa. Emma le a papa. Emma le, mamá le, papá le. Yo leo. Le leo, mamá? Leo a Meme? And I'll pick something a little harder. Let me see. Okay, here I found something. It's called El Gusanito, and it says underneath, cuento, which means story. Era un gusanito feo. Todos sus amigos se reían de él. Cansado, dejó su casita y se escondió. Un día apareció un agujero. ¿Qué pasará? Todos recordaron al gusanito feo. ¡Qué chasco! Salió una mariposita hermosa. So this is a story about a caterpillar that turns into a butterfly. Here's one about ants. I mean, the book is not full of stories about bugs, but these are the two I picked. Las hormiguitas salen del hormiguero. Salen del hormiguero y siguen su caminito. Jugarán en el guindo con sus amiguitas. Ya terminaron todas sus tareas. ¡Qué contentas están! Now here's another book that I have two copies of. One in English and one in French. And now you know that I grew up reading and speaking French, so the original one was the French one. But a bunch of years ago in a used bookstore, I found a copy in English, and I thought, that's very useful, because my grandchildren don't speak French, so I can read them some of these stories in English. Now, this book is a big book and has lots of stories, but it's one story. It's the story, the title is The Country of 36,000 Wishes. The author is André Mauroy, and the illustrations are by Adrienne Ségur. Adrienne Ségur. And it was published by a French company and then by an American company. But you saw the covers are the same. There are a lot of drawings, and I remembered them. I remembered most of them. But I couldn't find one I really wanted to copy. I mean, this one is a drawing that I remembered really well. The little girl with the pharaoh. But I just went for not a whole picture, but a feeling of a picture. You see these trees or bushes or whatever? That's what I ended up copying. Can you see it? I went all the way down the center of my back. One of the things I noticed reading this book in English is that it's not always easy to translate. Certain ideas work, but if you're going to pick a funny name for a character, for instance, in French, there's a character who is a crow, a very well-dressed crow actually, and his name in French is Honteux et confus. And I just want you to see how it's written because it's all one long word. but it's three words in French that have been pushed together and slightly misspelled. And it means embarrassed and confused. Now that's a great name. Imagine calling your pet embarrassed and confused. But the name that he was given in the English, it just doesn't work for me exactly. He's called Mr. Crestfallen. Now maybe there's something similar about that, but it's not funny the way honteuse et confus. And there are other names like that throughout in the book. Anyway, the part I want to read to you is Michelle, this is the girl, and her meeting with Mr. Crestfallen, or, as I knew him, honteuse et confus. She is being read to by her brother Oliver, and he's reading about some story that has to do with Pharaoh, who has a dream. And she falls asleep, so the whole thing is a dream until toward the end, where she wakes up and then she wants to go back to the place of the country of 36,000 wishes. And she manages to get back in another dream, but it's not the same anymore. And you're going to find out why. Chapter 2, Mr. Crestfallen. After a ride which seemed very long to Michelle, and which had lasted perhaps 2 or 3 hours, some trees appeared in the middle of the sand. Then she saw a dark spot in the distance, and the camel stopped. She's on a camel, you see. And the camel stopped at the edge of a forest. Michelle climbed down and saw a sign nailed on a pine tree. She read, "The Magic Park. For information, see Mr. Crestfallen, Raven on duty." When she was closer, she noticed in the bark of the tree there was cut a small wicket or barred window like those in the ticket offices or at the station or at the theater. She knocked at the window. No one answered. She knocked harder and she heard, "Caw, caw, of course, of course." Now, let's take a break. Caw, caw is what a crow sings, right? In the French, they have him going, "Quack, quack, voila, voila, quack, quack." So just listen, because quack, quack sounds like caw, caw. But it also means something in French. It means believe. And you don't have that in the English. So you see, you miss a little something. So, caw, caw, of course, of course. The wicket opened and she saw an old raven wearing spectacles on his beak. We call them glasses nowadays. A black cloth cap on his head and a little black alpaca vest. "Are you Mr. Crestfallen?" asked Michelle. "Of course," answered the raven. Michelle could hardly keep from saying, "If only your note is as fine as your coat." Ah, now that is a line she's quoting from the fable by Aesop, Aesop's fable, and then translated by the French. But there's a fable about the raven and the fox, and the raven has got a piece of cheese or something yummy in its beak, and the fox wants it. So he decides that he's going to flatter the raven into singing, because he says, "Oh, I've heard you have a beautiful voice." The minute he sings, of course, he'll drop the cheese, and then the fox has the cheese and the raven has nothing. Anyway, that's what she's quoting from. So she's learning this, and it's in the story. She's learning this at school by heart. So Michelle could hardly keep from saying, "If only your note is as fine as your coat." But she was afraid he would be offended, and said simply, "Mr. Raven, I can't understand what has happened to me. I was at home in my own bed, and all of a sudden I found myself in a desert. Then I met an old stone gentleman who told me he was a pharaoh and advised me to go to the magic park. Then I took a camel and came here. and now I don't know what to do. Can you let me in?" The raven adjusted his spectacles on his nose, looked carefully at Michelle, and said to her, "But are you a fairy?" "I? No, Mr. Raven." "Oh, well, that's very bothering," said Mr. Crestfallen. "Only fairies are allowed to enter the magic park. Would you like to become a fairy?" "Well, certainly," said Michelle. "Can I?" "Of course," said the raven, rubbing himself hard with his wings. "Of course." "But there's still a little test which you must first pass." "What?" said Michelle. "I have to take a test to be a fairy?" So this has to do with stuff that's going on at school. She's doing tests, right? "Of course," said Mr. Crestfallen. "You must answer 3 questions that I shall ask you. If your answers please me, I shall write your name on the fairies' register, and if your answers displease me, you will get back on your camel and you will be invited to disappear into the desert. Are you ready?" Michelle was very much excited. She wanted to review everything she knew, but her ideas were all in a muddle. Of course, she thought, if he would only ask me to talk about Pharaoh or the desert, that would suit me very well. But if it is to be about the history of France, and she began to recite, the Gauls were pagans and they adored fire, sun, and thunder. She tried to remember her French history. Mr. Crestfallen had opened a little book. He took off his glasses, said 3 caws to clear his throat, and announced, "Arithmetic. How much is 8 times 6? 54, said Michelle. "Are you sure?" said Mr. Crestfallen. "Pretty sure," said Michelle. "Is it right?" Of course! You know if it's right, don't you?" asked Mr. Crestfallen. Now, just in case there's anybody here who missed it, that's not correct. But this is the story. This is not school. "What?" said Michelle. "Of course? Excuse me, of course. But don't you know?" I mean, after all, he's testing her, right? "Michelle," the raven answered with dignity, "you appear to forget that I am here to ask questions and not to answer them." Then he murmured, "Besides, in the magic park, 8 times 6 makes whatever you please." Next, he announced, "Spelling. How do you spell witch?" "Oh, that's easy," said Michelle. "Witch." She was particularly proud of having thought of the T, and added, "Isn't that right?" Now, when you're reading, not listening, you can see that the witch that he asked her was not the witch that's a lady who's a magician witch, but the witch that you say in a sentence, "Which dessert would you like?" And that's not spelt that way. Of course," he said hesitatingly. Just the same, it would be a good idea if you knew for sure," said Michelle. "That would not change the result of the examination at all," said Mr. Crestfallen severely. "Now please recite a fable for me." "All right," agreed Michelle eagerly. "I know the raven and the fox." That's the one I mentioned before, right? "I don't like that fable," said Mr. Crestfallen. Well, we know why, because he's a raven. "I know," said Michelle. I know the ant and the grasshopper, too." "Recite that," commanded Mr. Crestfallen. She had learned it a long time ago. She began. "A grasshopper gay sang the summer away and found herself poor by the winter's first roar. 'How spent you the summer?' quoth the ant, looking shame at the borrowing dame. 'You sang.' 'I'm at ease, for 'tis plain at a glance, now, ma'am, that you must dance.'" "I guess I have forgotten a little of it toward the end," said Michelle. "I didn't notice," said the raven. "I like that fable." "I like it too," said Michelle, "because it's short." "You have good taste," said Mr. Crestfallen. "Yours is the same as mine. I'm going to write your name in the fairies' book. What are your names and accomplishments?" "What does that mean?" That means, what is your name? Why didn't you say so? Said Michelle. I did say so. What is your name? My name is Michelle. How old are you? 7 years old, Michelle answered. Have you any brothers and sisters? 2 brothers and 1 sister. What is your rank in school? Are you ever the head of your class? Never, said Michelle. Fine, said the raven, who seemed reassured. I'm going to write your name in the register of the little girl fairies. From beside him he took a small card, fixed his glasses on his nose, and with difficulty began to write. Then he held out the card to Michelle. Mr. Crestfallen had very good handwriting, which closely resembled printed letters, and she could read without any difficulty. Miss Michelle, fairy of the 2nd class, is given the right to go anywhere in all of the magic kingdom and to make her 36,000 wishes there. For the Queen, Mr. Crestfallen, Raven on duty. And the next chapter is called Miss Heavens Above. So maybe you can guess what happens that she can't get back into the country of the 36,000 wishes in the Magic Kingdom. Should I give you a hint? When she comes back, because she had such a wonderful time and wants to go back, unfortunately she became a good student, and she knew that 8 times 6 is 48, and other things like that she didn't know before. And she became the head of her class, and that was not the place for her anymore. They only take the people who were not the head of the class and who don't actually know the answers. That's who gets to go into the Magic Kingdom. Anyway, I gave away the end of the book. But the pictures are beautiful, and I think you got to see some perhaps. But, and the book is in English, not just in French. And it was one of my favorites. And maybe it'll become one of yours too. I hope you can find it.